Racist man dumps trash on Big Shaq's luxury car, but Big Shaq doesn't strike back with fists or fury. Instead, he responds in a way that shocks everyone, turning a hateful act into an unforgettable lesson. When grace stands face to face with hate, even the darkest hearts are forced to confront their truth. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun poured down softly over the quiet, manicured lawns of Halcyon Ridge, a small upscale suburb just outside Atlanta. It was the kind of morning that made the world feel like it was holding its breath in comfort. Birds gliding low in lazy arcs, dogs wagging tails behind picket fences, and sprinklers ticking like soft metronomes on neatly trimmed grass. Shaquille O'Neal, known around the block simply as Shaq, was already up, coffee in hand, standing barefoot in the driveway of his modern brick home. He was a giant even in stillness, yet nothing about him seemed imposing. His presence didn't disturb the peace. It added to it. A familiar smile stretched across his face, as neighbors waved from porches and joggers gave their usual nods. He was more than a former basketball legend to these people. He was their own personal gentle giant, the kind who helped you move your couch without asking questions, who bought Girl Scout cookies from every kid on the street, and who once stayed up until midnight helping a neighbor's son build a science fair volcano. He didn't do it for attention. In fact, Shaq liked quiet more than applause these days. This morning was no different. Mara, his daughter, was sleeping in. The house was still and warm, filled with soft jazz on the speakers, and the smell of cinnamon rolls wafting from the kitchen. Lucille, his mother, had taught him to find joy in simplicity, and he carried her teachings into every hour of his day. He walked over to his custom matte black SUV, gleaming in the driveway like a grounded spaceship. As usual, he gave it a light tap on the hood. A habit, a hello, a ritual. But today, something was wrong. At first it didn't fully register. His smile lingered just a second too long as he moved closer. Coffee still balanced in his left hand. Then it hit him. The smell, the weight, the deliberate chaos. Garbage, piled high and rot, bags torn open and strewn like an angry artist's stroke over the windshield, the hood and roof. Banana peels, broken eggs, a moldy pizza box sticking out like a sore memory. His car had been vandalized, but not with spray paint or keys. No, this was personal. This was meant to humiliate, not destroy. Shaq stood motionless for a moment, the cup in his hand slowly lowering. The birds kept chirping. The wind moved on. But something had shifted. It wasn't just the act. It was the message. Someone had taken their time. This wasn't a teenager's prank. This wasn't careless. This was designed to provoke. He glanced around instinctively, and his eyes landed across the street. A man was watching him. He hadn't seen him before. Tall, lean, with pale skin and a stiff posture like someone always bracing for a hit. The man didn't move. Just stood in the driveway across the way, arms folded, gaze sharp and unapologetic. His house was the only one with no decorations, no signs of warmth. The lawn was trimmed but clinical, the porch bare. The man didn't flinch, didn't offer a nod, just stared at Shaq like he was waiting for something. Like he'd been waiting all morning for Shaq to step outside and see the mess. Shaq knew that kind of look. He'd seen it before. In locker rooms in the early 90s. In stares when he walked into boardrooms. It was the look of someone who had already decided who you were before you opened your mouth. A car door slammed somewhere nearby. A neighbor started her car and waved at Shaq before pulling away oblivious. The moment returned to silence. Shaq didn't react, not outwardly. He didn't shout, didn't storm across the street. He just walked slowly back into his house, his shadow stretching long across the driveway. Inside, he placed his coffee down and retrieved a pair of gloves and a large trash bag. He returned, stooping down, collecting the garbage piece by piece. Not because it was his job, not because he was used to it, but because he refused to let this become something bigger in that moment. Because the act of cleaning it up himself, quietly, was the only power he wanted to show. Yet, as he cleaned, he felt something growing under the surface. Not anger exactly, but a hum, a low internal rumble. He wasn't sure if it was sadness, or exhaustion, or something else entirely. Later that morning, Miara came down and saw the trash bag by the door. "Dad, what happened?" she asked, still rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Nothing to worry about," Shaq replied, gently steering her away. "Some raccoons got smart. That's all." She narrowed her eyes. but didn't push. Not because she believed him, but because she knew how he handled things. Quietly, with strength that didn't need volume. Still, the discomfort clung to the day. Every time he passed the window, he saw that man, Colton Briggs, as he'd later learn, working in his yard without expression, never looking up, but somehow always aware. A man who had chosen to enter a peaceful community with coldness already loaded in his chest. A man who had brought with him the old weight of division into a neighborhood that had, at least on the surface, tried to transcend it. That afternoon, Shaq sat on the porch, watching the sky turn from blue to pale gray. A breeze moved through the trees, the incident still fresh in his mind. What gnawed at him most wasn't the trash. It was the intent. What did someone have to carry in their heart to make that choice? The day ended without confrontation, without accusation. But it didn't end peacefully, because something had been set in motion. A quiet tension that would stretch its arms over the coming days, wrapping around the neighborhood like smoke. That night, as he locked the front door and checked on Mira, Shaq glanced once more out the window. The light across the street was on. Colton Briggs was sitting on his porch now, still, eyes closed, as if preparing for a storm only he could see coming. Shaq whispered into the dark, not for anyone to hear. This place deserves better. And in that moment, the morning that had started like every other had truly changed. Everything. Not just for him, but for everyone in Halcyon Ridge. What began with garbage was no longer about trash. It was about truth, about silence, about what a man chooses to do when the world tries to drag him into hate's arena. Shaq wasn't going to step into that ring, but that didn't mean he wouldn't fight. Just not in the way anyone expected. The garbage incident might have been over, but it didn't leave. It clung to the corners of Shaq's mind like a stubborn fog, refusing to lift. He went about his routines, morning workouts in the garage gym, watering the front lawn, waving to passing neighbors, but the warmth in his gestures had cooled, not enough for most to notice, but enough for him to feel, the kind of chill that starts in the bones, quiet and persistent. He hadn't spoken to Colton Briggs, hadn't knocked on his door, hadn't asked a single question. That wasn't how Shaq operated. He wasn't afraid. He'd faced enough in life to be immune to intimidation. But he was careful. The real danger wasn't in raised voices. It was in the silence. The stares, the moments between moments. It started with the feeling of being watched. Subtle, like a prickling sensation across the back of his neck. He'd be trimming the hedges, and suddenly he'd sense it. Eyes on him. He turned once and caught Colton's silhouette through the wooden slats of the fence. Not moving. Just there. Staring. No expression. No acknowledgement. A statue carved out of suspicion and stone. At first, Shaq chalked it up to paranoia. Maybe Colton was just awkward. Not used to diverse neighborhoods. Maybe it was nothing more than an old man's discomfort with change. But then the tire went flat. A clean, deep slice through the sidewall. No nail, no debris on the road. Just a precision cut. The kind someone makes when they want to send a message without making noise. Shaq changed it himself. Didn't complain. Didn't even bring it up at the tire shop when the guy asked if he wanted to file a police report. He just smiled and said, "Nah, accidents happen." Then came the paint. An uneven smear of something oily and dark across the rear passenger door. Not enough to ruin the finish, but enough to be seen and smelled. Burnt rubber and cheap chemical. Intent disguised as randomness. This was different. This wasn't kids playing games. This was someone testing boundaries. Seeing how far they could push without hearing a snap. Shaq didn't snap. He didn't even raise his voice. But the piece he carried like armor. That began to dent. Mara noticed before anyone else. She'd started to walk around the car slowly in the mornings, examining things in silence. She didn't ask questions. She just watched her father, his posture, his silence, the way his eyes lingered longer on the mailbox, the slight pause when passing the living room window. One evening, Shaq stood at the kitchen sink, hands submerged in warm soapy water, watching the shadows outside stretch as the sun dipped. He saw Colton again, standing on his porch, sipping from a silver thermos. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Colton didn't look away. That stare held something unfamiliar. Resentment, yes, but something deeper, something wounded. A man who wasn't just hating someone else. He was trying to survive something inside himself, and Shaq recognized it, because he'd seen that look before in rivals, in teammates, in broken kids trying to stand tall in systems built to crush them. But recognizing it didn't mean excusing it. That night, Shaq got in his car, drove 2 hours south to visit the one person who could help him steady the shaking ground under his feet. His mother, Lucille. She lived in a modest one-story house, nestled between pecan trees and magnolia blossoms. The kind of home where the past still lived in photographs, on the walls, and the smell of cornbread never quite left the kitchen. Lucille met him at the door before he even knocked. "You look like the world's trying to take something from you," she said, wrapping him in a hug that made him feel like a boy again. They sat in the living room, soft jazz humming low in the background. Shaq didn't tell her everything. He didn't need to. Lucille had always known how to read the space between his words. "You're not mad," she said after a long pause. "You're tired. You're tired of being the bigger man." He didn't answer. "You've been carrying grace like a shield for decades, baby," she continued, her voice smooth but firm. "But even shields get heavy. You just don't want to put it down, because you think if you do, you'll become what they see. And you won't. You never could." Shaq looked at the photo of his late stepfather on the mantel. A man who'd raised him like his own, who had taught him to choose dignity over dominance. "What if ignoring it just makes it worse?" he asked. Lucille leaned forward. "And what if feeding it makes it grow? That man across the street ain't looking for a fight. He's looking for proof. Don't give it to him." He nodded slowly. Not in agreement, but in understanding. The kind that doesn't bring peace, but brings clarity. Driving back, the streets felt emptier. He pulled into the driveway just after midnight, headlights sweeping across the fence line. Colton's house was dark. Still, Shaq sat there for a few minutes before killing the engine. The silence pressed in around him. The next morning, another neighbor, a wiry woman named Trina, with 3 poodles and an obsession with lawn perfection, approached him on her morning walk. "Heard about your tire," she said, voice casual but too pointed to be coincidence. Shaq gave a soft shrug. "Bad luck, I guess." Trina frowned, clearly wanting him to say more. "Colton's different," she said carefully. "Moved in 2 weeks ago. Nobody's seen him smile. Not once. Doesn't wave. Doesn't speak." Shaq just nodded, his expression unreadable. "Difference not a crime." Trina walked away, unsatisfied. By the week's end, the air around the house felt electric. Like something unsaid was building, thread by thread. The tension wasn't loud. It was quiet and tight, like a bowstring drawn and held.
Wilmara asked if she could sleep over at a friend's house.
Shaq knew why. She didn't say it, but he saw the unease in her eyes, and that broke something small in him. Because it wasn't just about what Colton was doing, it was about what it was doing to them. He spent that night in his backyard, sitting in a lawn chair under the stars, thinking about fences, how some were meant to keep danger out, others to keep shame in, and some, like the one between his house and Colton's, weren't meant to be fences at all. They were walls, built from fear, from history, from assumptions stacked brick by brick over decades. And yet, they weren't impenetrable. The final straw came on Sunday. Shaq found a single note taped to his mailbox. Just one line written in thick, blocky letters. "Don't push it." No name, no address. But the message was clear. He held the paper in his hands longer than he should have. Not angry, not scared, just quiet. The kind of quiet that settles in when a choice has to be made. That evening he called his mom again, told her everything. She listened without interruption, then said just one thing before hanging up. "Don't let his shadow change your light." Shaq sat at his desk, pulled out a notebook and began to write. Not for a lawyer, not for the police, but for himself. A journal, a record, of what was happening, of how he was feeling. Because stories like his often got twisted, buried under noise, dismissed as exaggeration. This one wouldn't. That night he went outside, walked to the fence, and stood in the glow of his porch light. He didn't say anything, just stood there, looking out, not at Colton, just at the night. After a few minutes he turned and went back inside. No confrontation. No war. Just a presence. The same way Colton had been watching him. Shaq was now watching back. Not with threat, but with resilience. And the neighborhood began to feel it. Not in loud ways, but in glances, in whispers, in the way people's smiles changed. Tighter, shorter. Something was shifting. And no one knew which way it would fall. Halcyon Ridge had a look. Pristine driveways, trimmed hedges, American flags rippling lazily in the breeze. Kids playing hopscotch on sidewalks that were swept more often than some homes were dusted. It sold the image of warmth, security, and inclusion. The kind of neighborhood that smiled wide and waved hard, where new families were welcomed with baskets and block parties, where neighbors knew each other's dogs by name. But beneath that glossy layer of courtesy lived something older, something harder, a quiet discomfort that didn't always speak, but you could feel it listening. Shaq had felt it before. Not the loud, obvious kind. Not the hateful slurs or doors slammed in faces. No, this was subtler, sharper, like a knife you didn't notice until you were already bleeding. He remembered the way it looked during his first week in the neighborhood, how everyone had been eager to shake his hand, tell him they grew up watching him play, ask for a photo. But then there were the looks. Not all, but enough. Eyes that flicked to the moving truck like it didn't belong. Questions that circled back to property values, a little too often. Must be nice to have that kind of money, one man had said, smiling too tightly. I mean, for just playing a game. He'd smiled right back. Politeness was the language of Halcyon Ridge, but not all words were meant as compliments. There had been a cookout last summer. Just after he moved in, he'd been invited to join a group around the grill, where jokes flew as freely as the beer. At first, it was lighthearted. Talk of sports, weather, local high school rivalries. Then someone, Brett Simons, the HOA treasurer, said, "Bet you don't even lock your doors, huh, Shaq? Big guy like you, who'd try you." The laughter that followed wasn't mean, but it wasn't innocent either. There was a story underneath it. A suggestion. That same afternoon, a woman with frosted hair and diamond-studded flip-flops had asked if Shaq ever felt like going back to where he came from. She said it with a laugh. She meant it as a joke, but the way she looked at him after the flash of something cautious in her eyes told him exactly what the joke was made of. He hadn't said anything, just smiled. He'd learned long ago that the best armor in rooms like that was silence and stature, not because he didn't have words, but because people only listened when they wanted to, and most didn't want to hear the truth if it made them uncomfortable. The truth was, the garbage wasn't the first shot. It was just the first one people could see, and someone else had started to see it too. Rhett Lawson wasn't supposed to be in Halcyon Ridge. He was a freelance journalist out of Asheville, who'd made his name with human interest stories that always found a different angle. The producer who hired him to shadow Shaq for a legacy profile on resilience thought it would be a puff piece. Shaq the Gentle Giant, they called it. But Rhett had seen something else. He hadn't told Shaq yet that he'd started recording more than interviews, that he'd quietly placed discreet motion-triggered cams across select corners of the yard with Shaq's security team's permission, intended to catch any fan intrusions or curiosity seekers. Instead, they caught subtle moments that told a deeper story. A week after the garbage incident, Rhett reviewed the footage and found Colton standing on his porch well past midnight, unmoving, just watching Shaq's house. No phone in hand, no smoke, just watching. The timestamp read 12:47. Another clip showed a teenager on a bike slowing down near Shaq's mailbox, tossing something into it, then speeding off. That was 3 nights before the threatening note. The kid wasn't from the neighborhood. He wore no school colors, no ID, just a hoodie and haze. Rhett saved the clip, disturbed but intrigued. He was beginning to realize the story he was uncovering wasn't just about a former athlete finding peace in retirement. It was about what that peace cost. Meanwhile, Shaq tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. He didn't mention the paint smear again, didn't bring up the tire or the note to Mamera, who was now more withdrawn, asking to spend more time at friends' houses, or staying up late in her room with headphones on. Her light stayed on longer these days, like she didn't want to face the dark outside her window. At a neighborhood board meeting later that week, Shaq showed up quietly, sitting in the back. It was a conversation about zoning, tree removal, and an upcoming spring fair. The room was all smiles and paper cups of lemonade. No one brought up the tire, or the paint, or the trash, but the glances toward him carried weight. One woman asked if they could set standards for driveway vehicle appearances, to keep the neighborhood looking aligned. Another nodded, adding something about preserving traditional values. No one mentioned Shaq's name, but they didn't need to. It was there, in the room, in the way people cleared their throats before speaking, in the way their eyes didn't quite meet his. Halcyon Ridge was trying to push something under the rug, but the rug was getting crowded. After the meeting, Rhett caught up with him in the parking lot. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. Shaq shrugged. "Depends what you mean by okay. I mean, Are you pretending not to notice? Or are you just used to it? Shaq stopped walking, looked at him. Both.
Rhett didn't record that answer. He didn't need to. It etched itself into his thoughts.
Later that night, Rhett reviewed older footage from Shaq's house. One clip stood out. It was from 2 days before the trash incident. It showed Colton dragging 2 large black bags out of his garage, but instead of heading toward his bin, he crossed the street, walking toward Shaq's drive, then cutting left, disappearing from frame. Minutes later, he returned empty-handed. No hesitation, no urgency. It was calculated. The story was no longer about suspicion. It was about proof. But Rhett hesitated. If he brought this forward, if he pushed it into the public eye, it wouldn't just be about Colton. It would be about Halcyon Ridge. About the polite racism that smiled in daylight and whispered in HOA emails. It would be about a system that allowed it to thrive by disguising it as tradition, as preference, as just the way things are. Shaq wasn't oblivious. But he was deliberate. He believed in leading by presence, not provocation. And that was what made it so complicated. Because exposing what was happening would mean exposing him too. His pain, his restraint, his choice to carry weight, instead of throwing it. That Sunday, at a local bookstore downtown, a woman approached Shaq while he was browsing a biography on John Lewis. She was maybe in her mid-40s, dressed in business casual, eyes sharp but kind. She introduced herself as Eleanor Nash, a social worker who'd grown up in the neighborhood decades ago. "I just wanted to say," she began, "I see what's happening, even if most people pretend they don't." Shaq didn't react. "I lived on Hunter's Lane as a kid. We were the only black family for 6 blocks. Nothing's changed, except now they smile when they say the same things." Shaq looked at her. "You still live here?" "No," she replied. "I left. Got tired of being the only one holding the mirror." He nodded slowly. "Maybe I'm still holding it up." "Maybe," she said. "Just don't forget to turn it around sometimes. Let them see themselves." That stayed with him. He returned home to find Mara sitting on the steps, knees pulled in, eyes distant. She didn't say anything, just handed him her phone. A photo had been sent to her anonymously, a shot of her walking to school with a red circle drawn around her, and the words "must be nice. Daddy buys your life." Shaq stared at it. She waited. Then he sat down next to her, placed the phone aside and said quietly, "They can draw all the circles they want. You're not inside any of them. You walk your own line." Her eyes welled, but she nodded. That night, Rhett finally approached Shaq with the footage. Shaq watched it once, said nothing, just sat in silence for a long time after it ended. "I can release it," Rhett offered. "Let people see what's going on." Shaq shook his head. "Not yet." "Why?" "Because they'll make it about him. About Colton. I don't want to feed that. This isn't about a man. It's about a pattern." "Then what do we do?" Shaq stood, eyes steady. "We wait. We watch. We build the full story. Not the loudest one. The real one." The neighborhood continued to smile. But the cracks had formed. The surface wasn't as smooth anymore. People started to lower their voices a little more when they saw Shaq walk by. He'd become a mirror, and nobody likes seeing what they've taught themselves not to look at. The garbage was just the beginning. The story had been waiting under the surface for a long time. Now it was rising. He hadn't said anything. Just smiled. He'd learned long ago that the best armor in rooms like that was silence and stature. Not because he didn't have words, but because people only listened when they wanted to. And most didn't want to hear the truth if it made them uncomfortable. The truth was, the garbage wasn't the first shot. It was just the first one people could see. And someone else had started to see it too. Rhett Lawson wasn't supposed to be in Halcyon Ridge. He was a freelance journalist out of Asheville, who'd made his name with human interest stories that always found a different angle. The producer who hired him to shadow Shaq for a legacy profile on resilience thought it would be a puff piece. Shaq the Gentle Giant, they called it. But Rhett had seen something else. He hadn't told Shaq yet that he'd started recording more than interviews, that he'd quietly placed discreet motion-triggered cams across select corners of the yard with Shaq's security team's permission, intended to catch any fan intrusions or curiosity seekers. Instead, they caught subtle moments that told a deeper story. A week after the garbage incident, Rhett reviewed the footage and found Colton standing on his porch well past midnight, unmoving, just watching Shaq's house. No phone in hand. No smoke, just watching. The timestamp read 12:40. Another clip showed a teenager on a bike slowing down near Shaq's mailbox, tossing something into it, then speeding off. That was 3 nights before the threatening note. The kid wasn't from the neighborhood. He wore no school colors, no ID, just a hoodie and haste. Rhett saved the clip, disturbed but intrigued. He was beginning to realize the story he was uncovering wasn't just about a former athlete finding peace in retirement. It was about what that peace cost. Meanwhile, Shaq tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. He didn't mention the paint smear again, didn't bring up the tire or the note to Mira, who was now more withdrawn, asking to spend more time at friends' houses, or staying up late in her room with headphones on. Her light stayed on longer these days, like she didn't want to face the dark outside her window. At a neighborhood board meeting later that week, Shaq showed up quietly, sitting in the back. It was a conversation about zoning, tree removal, and an upcoming spring fair. The room was all smiles and paper cups of lemonade. No one brought up the tire, or the paint, or the trash, but the glances toward him carried weight. One woman asked if they could set standards for driveway vehicle appearances to keep the neighborhood looking aligned. Another nodded, adding something about preserving traditional values. No one mentioned Shaq's name, but they didn't need to. It was there, in the room, in the way people cleared their throats before speaking, in the way their eyes didn't quite meet his. Halcyon Ridge was trying to push something under the rug, but the rug was getting crowded. After the meeting, Rhett caught up with him in the parking lot. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. Shaq shrugged. "Depends what you mean by okay. I mean, are you pretending not to notice? Or are you just used to it?" Shaq stopped walking, looked at him. "Both." Rhett didn't record that answer. He didn't need to. It etched itself into his thoughts. Later that night, Rhett reviewed older footage from Shaq's house. One clip stood out. It was from 2 days before the trash incident. It showed Colton dragging 2 large black bags out of his garage, but instead of heading toward his bin, he crossed the street, walking toward Shaq's drive, then cutting left, disappearing from frame. Minutes later, he returned empty-handed. No hesitation, no urgency. It was calculated. The story was no longer about suspicion. It was about proof. But Rhett hesitated. If he brought this forward, if he pushed it into the public eye, it wouldn't just be about Colton. It would be about Halcyon Ridge, about the polite racism that smiled in daylight and whispered in HOA email. It would be about a system that allowed it to thrive by disguising it as tradition, as preference, as just the way things are. Shaq wasn't oblivious, but he was deliberate. He believed in leading by presence, not provocation, and that was what made it so complicated. Because exposing what was happening would mean exposing him too. His pain, his restraint, his choice to carry weight, instead of throwing it. That Sunday, at a local bookstore downtown, a woman approached Shaq while he was browsing a biography on John Lewis. She was maybe in her mid-40s, dressed in business casual, eyes sharp but kind. She introduced herself as Eleanor Nash, a social worker who'd grown up in the neighborhood decades ago. "I just wanted to say," she began, "I see what's happening, even if most people pretend they don't." Shaq didn't react. "I lived on Hunter's Lane as a kid. We were the only black family for 6 blocks. Nothing's changed, except now they smile when they say the same things." Shaq looked at her. "You still live here?" "No," she replied. "I left. Got tired of being the only one holding the mirror." He nodded slowly. "Maybe I'm still holding it up." "Maybe," she said. "Just don't forget to turn it around sometimes. Let them see themselves." That stayed with him. He returned home to find Mara sitting on the steps, knees pulled in, eyes distant. She didn't say anything, just handed him her phone. A photo had been sent to her anonymously, a shot of her walking to school with a red circle drawn around her, and the words "must be nice. Daddy buys your life." Shaq stared at it. She waited. Then he sat down next to her, placed the phone aside and said quietly, "They can draw all the circles they want. You're not inside any of them. You walk your own line." Her eyes welled, but she nodded. That night, Rhett finally approached Shaq with the footage. Shaq watched it once, said nothing, just sat in silence for a long time after it ended. "I can release it," Rhett offered. "Let people see what's going on." Shaq shook his head. "Not yet." "Why?" "Because they'll make it about him. About Colton. I don't want to feed that. This isn't about a man, it's about a pattern." "Then what do we do?" Shaq stood, eyes steady. "We wait, we watch, we build the full story. Not the loudest one, the real one. The neighborhood continued to smile, but the cracks had formed. The surface wasn't as smooth anymore. People started to lower their voices a little more. When they saw Shaq walk by, he'd become a mirror, and nobody likes seeing what they've taught themselves not to look at. The garbage was just the beginning. The story had been waiting under the surface for a long time. Now it was rising. The morning air was thick with Georgia humidity, the kind that hugged your skin before you even made it to the porch. Shaq had taken to early walks again, quiet laps around Halcyon Ridge before the neighborhood fully woke. It was one of the few times the place felt honest before the curated smiles and polite waves came out with the sun. He hadn't expected the bakery to be open so early. Vale's bread and butter had always struck him as a little too cute for its own good, with its chalkboard signs and string lights strung year-round. But that morning the smell of warm cinnamon and sourdough pulled at something deeper. Familiarity. He paused at the door, peered inside. No customers, just one person behind the counter. She was dancing. Not with grace, but with conviction. Hair tied up in a bandana, apron covered in flour, earbuds in as she spun between trays of croissants and a steaming espresso machine. When she noticed him watching, she froze for a second, then popped one bud out with an embarrassed laugh. "Caught me mid-conga," she said, brushing her hands off on her apron. Shaq grinned. "Didn't know this place came with a floor show." "Only if you're lucky," she replied, then tilted her head slightly. "You're Shaquille, right?" "Shaquille O'Neal." He nodded. "Most people around here just call me Shaq." "Juniper," she said, offering a hand. "You can call me Junie." Her hand was small but firm, the kind of grip that didn't try to prove anything. She looked younger than she probably was, maybe early 30s, with eyes that flicked around a room like they were always taking inventory. Not nosy, just alert. "You're out early," she said, moving back behind the counter. "Trying to catch the day before it catches me," he said. Junie smiled at that, poured him a coffee without asking, added 2 sugars and a splash of cream, like she already knew. He didn't question it. As he sipped, she leaned on the counter, watching him carefully. "You know, people in this neighborhood, they think they're being subtle." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "I grew up in a town like this. Polished on the outside, ugly under the paint. My dad used to say, we don't hate people, we just protect our own, which is code for the same old mess." I used to believe him. Until I didn't. Shaq didn't respond. He'd learned when to let people talk. Junie glanced around, lowered her voice. "I've seen your neighbor. Colton, right? Tall, angry-looking guy who won't make eye contact even when I wave. I've seen him out late, real late. In the alley behind the store, dumping stuff, watching your house." Shaq kept his face still. "Last week I saw him toss something in a storm drain. Looked like he didn't want it found." "What'd you do?" Shaq asked quietly. "I watched," she said. "I'm not proud of that, but I didn't know what to do." He gives me that same look my uncle used to give the TV whenever a black family won something on game shows. Shaq took another sip of coffee. "People reveal themselves eventually. Sometimes you just have to wait them out." Junie nodded slowly. "Thing is, I don't think he's just hateful. I think he's scared." Shaq looked up. "Scared of what?" Junie shrugged. "I don't know. Change, maybe. Losing control. Or maybe it's something personal. I've seen that kind of weight before. Guilt wears the same jacket as hate. It just buttons up different." He studied her for a moment. She wasn't performing. Her words were raw, unfiltered, and they landed. "Ever think about saying something?" he asked. "Every day," she said. "But I also know what happens in places like this when people like me speak up. You don't get threats, you get silence. People stop buying bread. You become the whisper no one wants in their house." She chuckled softly, no humor in it. "But something's happening. You know that, right? It's not just you. I've heard people talking, there's tension, like the whole block's waiting for something to break." Shaq leaned on the counter, eyes fixed on hers. "What are they saying?" Junie hesitated. "Some think you're playing the victim, that you're trying to stir things up for attention." He didn't flinch. "Others think you're planning something, that you're filming everything, building a case. A few of them are scared you'll go public." Shaq gave a slow nod. "People always fear what they can't control." Junie leaned closer. "You're not alone in this. I may not be much, but I see it. And I'm not going to just keep baking bread and pretending nothing's happening." There was a long pause between them, filled only by the soft beep of the oven and the thrum of air conditioning.
You ever feel guilty?
Shaq asked suddenly. Junie blinked. About what? About knowing the fire's burning, but not putting it out. She exhaled. Every day. But I'm trying to change that. I want to be more than a bystander. I'm just not sure how. Shaq placed a 20 on the counter, took another sip and said, "You just started." As he turned to leave, she called after him. "Hey, be careful. I think something's building with him. I think he's past the watching stage." Shaq paused at the door, looked back. "I've been watched my whole life," he said. "It's what happens when people don't know what to do with presents." He walked out, coffee warm in his hand, but the day feeling colder somehow. The next evening, Shaq sat with the footage Rhett had compiled. It was growing, patterns forming, bags dumped, glances caught, conversations between neighbors recorded at a distance, people talking about Shaq like he was a disruption, a threat, a storm forming over their manicured lives. Junie's words echoed. Guilt wears the same jacket as hate. It just buttons up different. He watched Colton on the screen, alone, pacing, standing in his garage for hours without doing anything, moving trash bags that didn't seem to contain trash. No confrontation, just movement. Always in the shadows. It wasn't just about race. It wasn't just about territory. There was something deeper, something personal. Shaq turned on the camera in his basement. "This morning I met someone who reminded me why grace still matters," he said to the lens. "Her name's Junie. She told me she's scared to speak. I get that. Fear's not weakness. It's survival sometimes. But she spoke anyway. That's strength." He paused. And then she said something that stuck. That guilt and hate look alike from far away. Maybe that's what this is. Maybe Colton's hate is just a mask for something he doesn't want to face. Or maybe it's both. Maybe it's everything. All I know is, if someone doesn't pull the mask off, it starts to grow roots. He leaned back. "I ain't trying to save him. I'm trying not to lose myself in the process." The next morning, Junie left a bag of warm biscuits and a note on his porch. "For your strength. For your restraint. For not giving them what they expect." No name signed. Just a hand-drawn heart. Shaq stood there for a long time. Sunlight breaking through the trees. Note in hand. Scent of butter and flour filling the air. In a neighborhood where everyone was trying to disappear into their roles, someone had stepped forward. Unexpected, kind, watching with different eyes. And it changed something. Not everything, but something. He copied the footage onto a small USB drive. Then he printed out a single photo from the video, a still of Colton's face in the moment he looked toward the door. Not confrontational, not proud, just present. He slid the drive and the photo into an unmarked envelope. No return address. And the next morning, he mailed it to Colton Briggs. He didn't leave a note. He didn't need to. The response came, not with words, but with absence. Colton vanished. For 2 days. No lights in the house. No movement. No car in the driveway. Curtains closed like a sealed vault. Shaq didn't ask around. He just watched. Wait. The tension in the neighborhood changed. People felt it. Even if they didn't understand it. Conversations outside grew shorter. Kids played quieter. A strange hush hung in the air like everyone was bracing for something they couldn't name. On the third day, Colton came back. And he wasn't alone. Shaq saw the truck pull up late afternoon. An old Dodge, dented and rust-colored. The kind that smelled of years and oil and long, hard roads. 3 men stepped out. All white. All built like Colton, thin but tough. Their postures hunched not with age but with suspicion. One had a thick black beard and wore a sleeveless shirt, even in the damp air. The ink on his forearm was unmistakable, a faded Confederate flag, the edges blurred with time. Another had a steel chain clipped to his jeans and a tattoo that read "Heritage Not Hate" across his neck. The third was younger, with a stare too hard for his age, and a scar that ran down the side of his face like punctuation. They didn't say a word, just walked into Colton's house like they belonged there. Shaq watched from his kitchen window, coffee cooling in his hand. He didn't flinch, didn't reach for his phone. He just stood still. The message wasn't subtle. It was louder than the dead raccoon. This was escalation. Not through violence, but through presence. Through implication. It was unspoken, the way most messages were in Halcyon Ridge. They wouldn't say what they thought. They just park their truck a little too long in front of your house. They just let the engine idle when your daughter walked past. They just let their laughter carry a little too far across the lawn. And still, Shaq said nothing. But he did act. He turned on the basement camera again. "This ain't a movie," he said. "Ain't no soundtrack to build suspense. No hero shot when someone stands tall. This is real. These are real people. And what they're doing ain't just about me. It's about making a point. It's about trying to draw me out of who I am." He paused. "I won't give them that." He leaned forward. "But I'm not naive. I see what they're doing. They're hoping fear does the work so they don't have to. They want me looking over my shoulder, wondering when, if, that's the trap. They want me angry enough to mess up, or scared enough to leave." He stared at the lens. "I'm staying." That night, rain returned. Not a storm, just enough to make the air thick again. The streets dark and reflective. At 10:47 p.m., Shaq saw the Dodge again. The three men weren't inside. It was parked across the street. No engine, no lights, just there, watching, from a distance. "Rhett," the reporter called the next morning. "You know who they are?" he asked, his voice tight. "I've got guesses. They're not from around here." "Neither am I," Shaq said. "You want me to go public?" Shaq thought for a moment. "No, not yet." "Why?" "Because this isn't about exposure, it's about pressure. And I need to see who cracks first." There was silence on the other end. Then, "You think he's scared?" Shaq nodded to himself. "I think he's drowning." The camera caught another moment the next day. Colton standing in his backyard, yelling into the phone. No audio, but his movements were erratic, angry, desperate. He kept pointing toward Shaq's house, pacing like a caged animal. Then he stopped, threw the phone onto the grass, picked it back up, walked inside. Dooney showed up again that afternoon. Another small brown bag in her hands. Inside, a sandwich and a handwritten note. "I don't know what this is turning into, but I know you didn't start it. Stay steady." Shaq waved to her from the porch. Didn't say anything. Because the rain had brought truth, and truth wasn't loud. It was still. It sat beside you, and waited. It started with the smell. Shaq had just come in from his evening walk 3 laps around the cul-de-sac, headphones in. Miles Davis on low. His mind drifting between memories and the growing unease that had become the undercurrent of his days. As he opened the fridge for a bottle of water, something sharp and acrid tickled his nose. Not the scent of something burning, not quite, but close. Faint, smoky, chemical. He turned toward the back door. Diesel, his dog, was already there. Ears up, tail still. A low growl vibrated in his chest. Shaq opened the door slowly, eyes scanning the edge of the yard. The air was darker than it should have been. Not just night dark, but haze dark. And then he saw it, behind the garage, near the back fence, where the grass met a patch of gravel, blackened earth, charred remnants of something that hadn't quite succeeded. A melted plastic bottle, the edge of a singed rag, a half-burned matchbook, dropped like regret. It hadn't worked. The flames had fizzled out before they could spread. But it had been real, and it had been close. By the time the firefighters arrived, the smoke was gone, the evidence reduced to soot, and half a footprint. One of the younger crew members kicked at the gravel, brows furrowed. "Someone tried to start a fire back here," he said. "But the ground's too damp. Didn't catch." Another firefighter, older, grayer, looked at Shaq with something unrateable in his eyes. "This wasn't random," he said. "This was placed." Shaq nodded. "I know. They didn't ask who he suspected. They didn't need to. The fire never touched the house. Never even made it to the garage siding. But it left a mark all the same. Not on the property, but on the atmosphere. A new kind of heat. Not from flames, but from intention. The fire was never meant to destroy. It was meant to whisper, to threaten without a signature." Rhett showed up the next morning, breath short, eyes wide, camera gear in the back seat of his Prius. "You need to let me run this," he said before even stepping out of the car. "This changes everything." Shaq stood on the porch, arms crossed. "Nothing's changed," he said calmly. "They tried to burn your house down. They tried to burn a message into the dirt." Rhett shook his head, pacing now. "Shaq, this is it. This is the piece. The escalation. The arc. We've got footage, timelines, motive. This isn't just a story anymore. It's a statement." Shaq stared out at the street. The Dodge truck was gone. Colton's curtains were still drawn, but the tension had thickened like fog. I'm not interested in turning this into a headline. Then what are you interested in? Red asked, frustrated. Shaq turned to him, voice low but sharp. Want to understand, not expose, not escalate. I want the why, Rhett, not just the what. Because if we don't get the why, none of this ever stops. Rhett didn't have an answer to that. Later that day, Shaq made a decision that surprised even himself. He drove to Colton's house, not to confront Colton, but to find Darla. She answered the door slowly, chain lock still fastened, eyes peering through the gap. She looked tired. Her hair was pulled back, her makeup half finished, as if the day had started and stopped somewhere between laundry and doubt. Mrs. Briggs, Shaq said gently, I don't mean to intrude. I just need to ask a question. She looked past him, scanning the street, then back into his eyes. After a long pause, she unlatched the chain and opened the door fully. Come in, she said quietly. The living room was beige and stiff. Plastic still clung to the corners of the couch. Family photos lined the wall, but none recent. No smiles, no warmth. Just snapshots of a family that once posed, once tried. Shaq remained standing. I'm not here for drama, he said. I just need to understand what's happening, why it's happening. Darla sat on the edge of an armchair, twisting her wedding ring slowly. He's not a monster, she said softly, eyes fixed on her hand. He's just lost. Shaq waited. She swallowed hard. Colton worked maintenance at Keller Tech. 22 years. Never missed a day. He cleaned the floors, fixed the pipes, ran inventory. He wasn't flashy, but he was steady. The kind of guy who took pride in keeping the place running. What happened? Shaq asked. They let him go 6 months ago, she said. Said they were restructuring. Said they were hiring a more diverse operations team. Told him the company needed to reflect the community it served. Shaq closed his eyes for a moment. They didn't fire him for being white, she continued, voice thin now. But he thinks they did. Thinks they replaced him with someone less qualified, because it looked better on paper. I told him it's more complicated than that. But he just shut down. Started drinking more. Started talking about how everything's stacked against him now. Started blaming. Me? Shaq asked. She looked up, pain written across her face. You moved in the same week he lost his job. Shaq exhaled. He thinks the world traded him in for someone bigger, louder, more powerful. Thinks you're the symbol of what he's not allowed to be anymore. Not just you. Everything you represent. Success, visibility, space. Shaq nodded slowly. And now, he asked, does he know what this is becoming? She didn't answer. Just stared at the floor. He's not talking to me anymore. She whispered. I think he's trying to prove something to himself. I think he's trying to make sense of his place. Shaq turned toward the door. Before he left, he said, if he starts a fire he can't control, someone else is going to get burned. Darla didn't respond. Back home, Shaq sat in the dark, the house quiet. Miara upstairs, Rhett texting updates from his laptop, asking again to publish. The USB with the fire footage sat on the table in front of him. He didn't touch it. Instead, he turned on the camera again. This one's not easy, he began. Because now I see it clearer than I wanted to. The man across the street? He ain't angry at me. He's angry at what he lost. And I became the placeholder for that loss. He leaned forward. But here's the thing. Nobody stole his job. Nobody took his worth. The system shifted. And he didn't shift with it. And now he wants to punish the shift, not the system. He's aiming his pain at the wrong house. He paused. I get it. I do. Because I've been angry before. I felt loss. I felt small. I just never used that to justify cruelty. That's the difference. He clicked the camera off. Outside, the night settled again, but the ground felt different. Like something buried had been stirred. Something that could ignite again if the air got just a little hotter. But Shaq wasn't afraid of fire. He'd walked through too many already. There was no fire in the words. Just wait. Colton looked down at his hands, the calluses on his knuckles, the dirt under his nails. I wasn't always like this, he said. I believe you. I worked hard. I kept my head down. Did my job. For 2 decades. Then one morning, they called me into the office and said they were letting me go. Said they needed to meet a diversity initiative. Said it wasn't personal. But it was. Shaq said nothing. I went home that night feeling like the world had changed and left me behind. And then I look out my window and see you moving in. Big house, big car, big presents. And all I could think was, how come he gets it all and I get nothing? His voice cracked. Just slightly. I wasn't mad at you. Not really. I was mad at what you represented. Success I never got. Respect I never earned. You're everything I was told I could be if I worked hard enough. But you got there. And I didn't. And I told myself someone had to be blamed. Shaq's expression remained unchanged. I told myself lies, Colton continued, eyes narrowing. Lies passed down by my dad, my grandfather. That the system was rigged for you now. That my hard work didn't matter anymore because I was the wrong color. I believed it because it was easier than looking in the mirror and admitting I'd hit my ceiling. Shaq waited a moment before speaking. That ceiling was built long before you or I were born. Built by people who convinced you the problem would always be someone who looked like me. Colton didn't answer. And that dead raccoon? The letter? The fire? Shaq asked, voice quiet but pointed. What were they supposed to fix? Colton looked away. I didn't start that fire. But you lit something else, Shaq said. And others followed. Colton nodded slowly. I didn't think it would go that far. It always does, Shaq replied. Once fear takes the wheel, it don't know how to stop. Another silence settled, but this one wasn't sharp. It was reflective, heavy. I was scared, Colton admitted. Still am. My whole identity's wrapped up in being the working man, the good neighbor, the dependable one. And then I lose my job and I lose my pride, and the next thing I know, I'm standing on my porch hating a man I've never spoken to. You don't know me, Shaq said. You only know the idea of me. Colton sighed. And you don't know what it's like to have your whole life shift and feel like you're not allowed to say it hurts. Shaq leaned back, eyes steady. You're right. I don't know your specific pain, but I know what it's like to be told to stay quiet when you're drowning. Colton looked up. I know what it's like to be expected to be gracious when people are throwing daggers and smiles. I know what it's like to be strong when the world begs you to crack so it can say, see? We told you so. We both know silence, but we wear it different. Colton swallowed hard. For the first time, his voice softened. I never meant for it to turn into this. I didn't know how far I'd gone until I saw my own daughter cry when she heard what I said about you. Shaq nodded. Pain passed down becomes poison. A wind swept through the yard, shaking the branches overhead. The chairs creaked beneath their weight, but neither man moved. Colton cleared his throat. So what now? We good? Shaq didn't answer right away. This ain't about being good, he said. This is about being honest. I'm not shaking hands and forgetting, but I'm listening. That's where it starts. Colton's face tightened. I don't want pity. You're not getting any, Shaq replied. You're getting space. Space to be better. But it's on you to walk into it. They sat there, the tension between them finally shifting into something less jagged. Not peace, not yet, but potential. From the upstairs windows, a few neighbors watched. Not openly, but discreetly. Curtains shifted. Phones hovered, but no one interrupted. Because even they understood something was happening here. Something most people never saw. Two men sitting at a table, not to argue, not to accuse, but to unravel a knot that had been tied long before either of them had learned to pull the rope. When Colton finally stood, he didn't speak, just nodded once, and walked back through the gate he'd come through. Shaq remained seated. A table between two worlds. Not a finish line, but a start. A week had passed since the sit-down under the oak tree. The table still stood there, empty now, but weighted by what had been said. Conversations like that didn't echo. They settled, like dust in sunbeams, quiet and everywhere. For the first time in weeks, the neighborhood had stilled. No smoke, no anonymous notes, no more midnight visits from strangers with tattoos, meant to provoke. But peace wasn't always silence. Sometimes it was just a breath before the next truth made itself known. Shaq sat on his porch one crisp morning, sipping coffee, watching Mira pull out of the driveway on her way to her internship at the community center. She was doing good work, mentoring, tutoring, helping design summer workshops for kids in the district. The center itself was tucked into the side of a public charter school 5 miles east, a place Shaq had quietly funded for over a decade. Not for publicity, not for legacy. It had just felt like the right thing to do, give kids the resources he'd once needed. offer a path that didn't demand superstardom just to escape the zip code. The school, Elridge Prep, had grown over the years. New tech, new classrooms, better meals, but he'd never stepped foot on campus publicly. He wanted it to belong to the community, not his name. That morning, Miara called him from the parking lot. "Dad," she said, "this is random, but did you know a guy named Colton used to work here?" Shaq's hand paused mid-sip. "No," he said slowly. "Well," she continued, "I just overheard something. One of the older teachers was talking about how a maintenance guy got let go last year, right before they brought in the new staff. I guess he'd been here a long time, said he didn't leave quietly." "What do you mean?" "There was talk," she said, voice lowered now, "that he was upset about changes, staffing changes, said something about how the school sold out to donors." "Dad," she said his name was Colton Briggs. The line went quiet. Shaq sat back, heart pounding, not with fear but with the sinking pull of realization. He ended the call gently, promised Miora he was fine, and went inside. In his office, he opened the file cabinet, where he kept records of his philanthropic projects. His assistant had compiled years of reports, anonymous staff turnover logs, budget overviews, consultant recommendations. He flipped through them slowly, methodically.
There it was.
A footnote from 11 months ago. Maintenance department reorganized as part of facilities upgrade. Redundant roles eliminated following donor-funded expansion. Redundant. The word hit harder than expected. He dug deeper, and with each document, the pieces aligned. Colton Briggs had been the janitor at Elridge Prep for 15 years. Quiet, reliable, a fixture. When the funding came in, the school had hired a new team contracted staff, younger, tech-savvy, efficiency over loyalty. The shift had made sense on paper. Shaq sank into his chair. He hadn't fired Colton, hadn't made a call, hadn't dropped a name, but the money, that had changed the structure, and the structure had quietly pushed Colton out. The trash wasn't random. It wasn't some neighborhood prank or anonymous hate from nowhere. It was Colton's trash. From Elridge, from the school, Shaq had helped evolve. And in some way, that truth landed harder than the dead raccoon. The letter, the fire, because it meant he'd been part of the domino that sent a man spiraling into bitterness, isolation, rage. Without knowing it, he had become the symbol of something taken, not just something achieved. He sat there staring at the papers, feeling the gravity of unintended consequence. Later that day, Rhett came by to review footage. He found Shaq still in the office, quiet, the files still open. "You good?" Rhett asked cautiously. Shaq didn't answer right away. "I found out where the trash came from," he finally said. Rhett raised an eyebrow. "Elridge Prep." Rhett sat down. "The school?" Shaq nodded. "He worked there. Long time. Until the restructure. Until I funded the restructure." A long silence passed. "You didn't fire him," Rhett offered. "I might as well have," Shaq replied. "The system did it with my money." "That's not on you." Shaq looked at him, eyes heavy. "Isn't it?" And that's where the conflict twisted. Because this wasn't a clean story anymore. The lines were bleeding into each other. Racism. Yes. But also displacement. Loss. A system that devoured people without ever stopping to see who got caught in the gears. Colton's actions couldn't be excused. The threats, the intimidation, the silent warfare. It had been wrong. Cruel. But understanding had stepped in now. And with it came a moral dilemma that refused to settle into simple binaries. Shaq turned on the camera again. "This is the part no one likes," he said. "The part where you realize you're not just the victim. That even when you're trying to do good, you can still become the reason someone else falls. Not through malice. Through momentum." He paused, jaw tight. "I gave that school money to help. And it did help. But it helped in a way that didn't see everyone. It built new doors while letting old ones close on people who didn't even know they were being locked out." He looked away for a moment, then back at the lens. Colton made choices. Bad ones. But before he did, he was erased. Slowly. Quietly. By a system that said thank you one day, and you're no longer needed the next. And I helped make that system run smoother. He turned the camera off. That night he sat on the back porch again. Same chair. Same still air. Junie stopped by around dusk, leaving another brown paper bag with lemon muffins and a note. "You're not responsible for his hate, but I respect that you're willing to ask where it came from." He didn't eat the muffins. He just sat there, the paper note in his lap, the quiet stretching out. Mira joined him eventually. Sat beside him, with her knees tucked up. "You're thinking hard," she said. "I'm thinking loud," he replied. She smiled. "That's worse." After a long silence, she asked, "You gonna do anything about it?" He looked at her. "I already am. I'm not reacting. I'm reflecting." She nodded, and they sat there together. And in that moment, justice and empathy weren't enemies. They were uncomfortable siblings sharing space, arguing without shouting. Because the real truth wasn't about who was right. It was about who was seen. And finally, painfully, both of them were. The first few speakers stuck to pleasantries. Then came the shift. A man near the back, Tom Willis, a retired insurance broker with too much time and not enough filters, stood and cleared his throat. "I just want to say," he began, "this neighborhood used to be quiet. Simple. Now every other week we're getting calls, news vans sniffing around, and next thing you know someone's gonna write a book about how racist we all are." A few people nodded. Janice didn't interrupt. Shaq didn't flinch. Tom went on, "I'm not saying anyone deserves to be harassed. I'm just saying, maybe we're not all built to be social experiments. Some people move in, bring their drama, stir up attention, and the rest of us are stuck picking up the pieces." Across the room, someone shifted in their seat, uncomfortably. Then came Mason Bright, a father of 3 and a former high school principal. He stood slowly. "I think we've all seen what's been happening," he said, "and some of us have been too quiet. I've watched Shaquille O'Neal carry himself with more grace than most of us would have under pressure. And I've also watched some of us betray our own values in whispers, in side glances, and in silence." A beat passed. "I have 3 sons. They know who Shaq is. But more than the basketball player, they've seen the man he is here, and I'd rather they learn from him than from anyone who's sat silent while he's been targeted." A soft ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, and then, like all things in the digital age, the moment cracked open wider. A teenager in the second row held up a phone. "There's something you all should see." He pressed play on a video that had gone viral overnight, first through local high school Snapchat threads, then outward like wildfire. It was taken outside the community pool. In the video, Brett Simons, a longtime board member, laughed as he imitated Shaq's walk, voice slurred in a mock drawl. "Big man with big money," Brett said, stumbling in the video. "Thinks he can buy peace and preach morals. That if I parked a Bentley out here, they'd kiss my feet too." The laughter in the video was louder than the image. It echoed through the rec hall like a slow slap. Brett, who had been seated near the front, stood up red-faced. "It was a joke. Come on. We've all said things when we've had a few." "No," said Mason. "You said what you meant." The drink just made it louder. More murmurs. A few people stood. Others sat lower in their seats, as if hoping invisibility would save them. Shaq walked to the front, slow and steady. The room went still. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't point fingers. He just looked out at them, at all the people who had waved at him for months, passed him in grocery aisles, taken selfies with him at block parties. And he asked one question. "What are we teaching our children about strength?" No one answered. Is it strength to throw garbage on someone's car? To mail threats? To light fires and pretend it's not your match? To make fun of a man behind his back because he didn't respond with anger when you wanted him to snap? Still silence. I was taught that strength isn't about what you can carry. It's about what you choose not to throw back. He let that sit for a moment. "I didn't come here to accuse. I came here because I live here. Same as you. I pay taxes. I take out the trash. I shovel snow when it comes. I'm not your headline. I'm your neighbor." A woman near the back began to cry quietly. Shaq continued. "Some of you want me to disappear quietly. Others want me to fight loud so you can blame me when things fall apart. But what I really want, what I hope we all want, is to build a place where being different isn't dangerous." His eyes scanned the room. "And if we can't have that, then what are we even pretending to be?" The room stayed quiet long after he stopped talking. No applause. No outrage. Just reflection. After a while, people began to file out. Slowly. Quietly. Not with resolution, but with recognition. Outside the rec hall, the wind had picked up. Leaves danced in the street. And in the hush that followed, Halcyon Ridge was finally seeing itself. Not through fences, not through filters, but through the cracks in its own performance. Later that night, Junie left a note taped to Shaq's front door. "They heard you. Whether they admit it or not, They heard you. Thank you for choosing the hard way. The honest way.
Minara found him on the porch again, sitting in the dark.
She didn't say anything. She just sat beside him. And sometimes, silence is what's left when truth has finally been spoken. The news didn't break with a press release. It didn't come from a podium or a carefully worded statement. It came quietly, almost absurdly, through a tweet from a local nonprofit account that barely had 200 followers. We're honored to welcome Mr. Colton Briggs to the team as a part-time facility support member. This opportunity is made possible by an anonymous donor who believes in second chances, community healing. Start again. Shaq was the anonymous donor, but the anonymity didn't last. Within hours, screenshots of the tweet were circulating, cross-posted, dissected. Blogs, radio shows, influencers, everyone had an opinion. Not just because Colton had been the villain in a neighborhood saga that had become a quiet national whisper, but because of who was making the first move towards something resembling redemption. Shaquille O'Neal, the man whose car had been trashed, the man whose property had been violated, the man who had been mocked, watched, threatened, and who still chose not to fight fire with fire, but to extend a hand most people didn't think he should. But it wasn't forgiveness. Shaq was clear about that when the media storm finally reached his door. He stood in front of the community center, no entourage, no suit, no filters, and faced a row of microphones with the same calm he'd carried through everything. I didn't do this to excuse what he did, he said. I did it because healing doesn't happen by humiliating people. It happens by offering a better direction. Colton has a long way to go. We all do. But someone had to break the pattern. That clip went viral in under an hour. But what shocked everyone wasn't what Shaq did. It was what Colton did next. He hadn't spoken to the media since the forum, hadn't returned calls, hadn't posted a single word online. But a week into his new role, sweeping gym floors, stacking chairs, replacing water jugs at the youth center, he agreed to appear on a local morning show, not for press, not for spin, for truth. The segment began light, as they always do, soft lighting, cheerful host, vague nods to the power of change. But when Colton sat down in the chair across from the host, something in his posture was different. He didn't lean in. He didn't smile. He looked tired, human. I used to blame the world, he began, voice hoarse. Blamed people who looked different. Thought my losses were someone else's fault. And then I did things, cruel things, to try and feel like I mattered again. But all I really did was make myself smaller. The host shifted in her seat. What changed? Colton looked directly into the camera. He did, he said. Shaquille, the man I hated for no real reason, other than he stood for something I didn't understand. He didn't punch me. He didn't shame me. He handed me a mirror, and I hated what I saw. He paused, eyes glassy. I spent years hating myself more than anyone else. I just aimed it outward so I didn't have to face it. And when he offered me help, real help, counseling, work, a place to show up and not be judged, I broke. The clip played on loop for days. Colton's breakdown wasn't performance. It was release. A confession not just of guilt, but of emptiness, of how easy it had been to believe the worst, when the world didn't offer you a better story. Back in Halcyon Ridge, the reactions were mixed. Some neighbors nodded quietly, more comfortable now that someone had admitted wrong. Others rolled their eyes, calling it PR rehab or a guilt strategy. But the ones who had stayed silent the longest, the ones whose discomfort was buried deeper, said nothing at all. Junie stopped by Shaq's porch again, this time with no baked goods. Just a handwritten card. You did what most of us never could. You turned hurt into a hinge, and now the door's open. Shaq sat on his porch that night, watching the wind move through the branches. Mara joined him again, legs tucked under her, scrolling through her phone. He's everywhere, she said, holding up a headline, From Hate to Healing, the Man Shaq Saved. That's intense. Shaq chuckled softly. They love a headline with neat edges. Was it the right thing? She asked. He thought for a moment. I don't know if it was right, but it was different, and sometimes that's enough. Miara studied him. You're not angry? He nodded. Sometimes, yeah, but I also know what anger does when you keep feeding it. Eventually it stops being yours. It becomes who you are. She leaned her head on his shoulder. You don't have to carry it alone, she said. I'm not, he replied. Not anymore. At the youth center, Colton began arriving early, staying late. He never asked for more than the tasks given. Never made excuses. Never tried to clear his name. He just worked. One afternoon, Shaq stopped by unannounced. Watched from the hallway, as Colton helped a young boy patch a flat on his bike, his hands moving carefully, his voice low. When the boy pedaled away, Colton looked up. They nodded at each other. No words, just acknowledgement. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't closure. It was understanding. And maybe that was the thing that shocked everyone the most. That strength could look like stillness. That kindness wasn't surrender. That real change didn't need applause. It just needed someone to stop the cycle long enough for another path to appear. It began with trash, not the kind that blows in from the curb on windy days or spills from overfilled bins, but the kind that's placed deliberately, pointedly, meant to stain more than a surface, meant to mark someone. But now, that trash was gone. The car sat in the driveway, washed and waxed, no longer smeared with garbage or hostility. The tires were new. The paint, restored. Its reflection shone crisp beneath the spring sun, unmarred. But no one looking at it would have known the story it had carried. No one would have seen the quiet war waged in the driveway, where silent hate had made its home. And yet, this wasn't about the car. Not really. Shaq stood at the window inside, arms crossed loosely, watching the way the sun danced on the hood. He wasn't thinking about engines or rims or clear coats. He was thinking about where the story had gone, what it had turned into, how something so petty, so juvenile, had become the unraveling thread of something much bigger. On the desk behind him sat a silver laptop. Open, the cursor blinked on the final entry of a folder titled simply Journal, Halcyon. Inside were videos, footage, notes, voice memos. Not for fame, not for proof, for clarity, for truth. Shaq clicked open the last file. A black screen filled with his voice filled the room. Steady, grounded. People always ask about strength. They think it's about size, about power, about how loud you can be when the world is against you. But I've learned something different. Strength isn't in how you hit, it's in how you don't. It's in choosing not to pass the pain forward, even when it would feel good, especially when it would feel good. The image fades into footage. Not public footage, not anything broadcasted, but soft handheld shots from the security system and Shaq's basement camera. A still porch, rain on a windshield, Colton walking up the driveway that night, with a raccoon, the letter on the welcome mat, the slow cleanup afterward. And in each frame there's no chaos, no retaliation, just Shaq steadfast, deliberate weathering. It wasn't about garbage. It wasn't even about me. It was about a man drowning in a story he'd been told all his life, about what he deserved, about who took it. He didn't hate me, he hated the mirror I held up just by existing. Cut to clips of Colton at the youth center, mopping floors, adjusting tables, listening to a group of boys discuss who was the greatest of all time, LeBron, Kobe, or Shaq. He doesn't interrupt, just smiles quietly from a distance. He was wrong. So was I in some ways. Not in my choices, but in my silence before all of it. I believed, like a lot of us do, that being good was enough. But sometimes, goodness isn't quiet. Sometimes it has to show up, be seen, even when it's uncomfortable. We hear Shaq's voice layered over images from the community forum, the moment he stood before the crowd, asking, "What are we teaching our children about strength?" Then the screen fades to black again. People ask me if I forgive him. But that's not the question. Forgiveness isn't a finish line, it's a beginning. What matters more is what he does with it, what we do with it. Because the truth is, we're not who we are at our worst. We're who we choose to be next. Cut to the backyard, the table under the oak tree. Empty chairs. We shared a table, and for once, nobody shouted. Nobody postured. We just sat. Two men, two lives, and somewhere between the silence and the truth, we found something worth holding on to.
The video ends.
Upstairs, Mira sits cross-legged on the floor, the glow from her own laptop lighting her face. She's watching the same journal entry. She closes it slowly, hands lingering over the keyboard. "Done?" Shaq asks gently, appearing in the doorway. She nods. "I think so." He walks in, sits beside her, the hardwood cool under their legs. "You ever gonna show it to anyone?" she asks. "Maybe," he replies. "Not yet." It was never about the audience. She looks at him. "It kind of changed everything, didn't it?" He exhales. "It changed me." That was enough. Outside, the neighborhood breathes a strange kind of calm. The smiles haven't all returned. Some people still cross the street a little earlier than they need to. Not everyone waves. But something's different now. Not because they all learned, but because someone refused to teach hate back. Junie's Bakery put out a new sign that week. Grace is stronger than revenge. Fresh sourdough available daily. Shaq chuckled when he saw it. She's still got flair, he muttered. Rhett's documentary never aired as originally planned. The network wanted a clean ending, a redemption arc, a climax, but Rhett knew better now. He kept the footage, recut it, named it The Weight We Don't Show, released it independently, and slowly, it found an audience. Not millions, but enough. People wrote in. Teachers, parents, former coworkers, even janitors. All saying the same thing, in different ways. I didn't know how to say what I was feeling. Until now. That, Shaq thought, was the real story. Not the trap. Not the fire. Not even the table. It was the space between those moments. The pauses where someone could have chosen retaliation, and instead chose reflection. Where a man, broken and misled, was given not absolution, but a window. And he stepped through. As spring turned to summer, Minora prepared to leave for college. She packed her bag slowly, leaving behind notes for her dad around the house, on the fridge, and the gym, even tucked into his favorite pair of sneakers. On the last night before she left, they stood in the driveway. The car was clean again. Not because of pride, but because it deserved to be. Promise me something, she said. Anything. Keep telling the story. Even if it hurts. Even if no one claps. He nodded. Only way I know how. And as she drove off, a warm breeze pushed through the trees, brushing against the house that had once been watched with suspicion. Now it stood still, quiet, strong. Shaq went back inside, sat at the kitchen table, and pulled out a new journal. This time, he titled it, What We Build When We Stop Breaking. He clicked the pen open, and began again. If this story made you feel something, don't scroll past it. Share it in your next hard conversation. Rewatch it when silence feels safer than truth. And remember, the smallest choice not to retaliate might be the loudest legacy you leave.